All right, let's dive into a real philosophical minefield. Um, Pornography and censorship. Today, we're going to tackle the question of whether a government can legitimately restrict consenting adults from accessing pornography in private. And since you, dear listener, are a philosopher, we're going to approach this with the kind of intellectual rigor you love.
It's a topic that's been debated for centuries. Really cuts to the heart of freedom of expression, individual autonomy, the role of the state.
Okay, so before we get lost in the philosophical weeds, maybe we should start with the basics. What exactly is pornography? I mean, it seems straightforward, but I suspect it's a lot more complicated than it looks.
Oh, you're absolutely right. That simple definition, sexually explicit material, is practically useless.
How so?
Well, because what one culture considers sexually explicit, another might consider totally normal.
Yeah, like remember when showing a woman's ankle was considered
It's
scandalous?
deadly. Standards change.
Yeah.
So we need a definition that's a little more, shall we say, philosophically robust.
So how do we move beyond just sexually explicit to something a little more, I don't know, conceptually sound?
Well, some argue that the key feature of pornography is its intent. It's material that's specifically designed to produce sexual arousal.
So that helps us distinguish between, let's say, a medical textbook with anatomical diagrams and, well, something you might find on an adult website.
Precisely.
So using that definition, a film like Last Tango in Paris, which definitely has sexually explicit content, wouldn't be considered pornography because its primary aim isn't just to arouse the viewer, right?
Exactly. It's using sexual content to explore these larger themes, desire, power, alienation. But even within this intent-based definition, there's a huge spectrum, right? You've got everything from feminist pornography, which aims to portray sexuality in a way that empowers women, to violent or degrading pornography, which raises all sorts of ethical red flags.
So we're already in the thick of it. Is all sexually explicit material inherently bad, or is it more complicated than that?
That's where the philosophical fireworks really start. Some argue that all pornography is bad because it's obscene.
Okay, in what sense?
It lacks any redeeming artistic or social value, and it depicts offensive sexual conduct. This is typically the view of more conservative critics, those who believe that the state has a role in upholding moral standards.
All right, so that's one side of the debate. I imagine there are others who strongly disagree. What's their argument?
Well, on the other side, you have the classic liberal argument. Competent adults should be free to indulge their private tastes, even if those tastes are considered, shall we say, lowbrow or offensive by others. They prioritize what's called negative liberty, freedom from interference, and they put the burden of proof on those who want to censor.
So for them, the key question is whether pornography actually causes harm to others, not whether it's morally objectionable in some abstract sense.
Right.
But wait, haven't some feminists argued that pornography is harmful, even if it doesn't involve overt violence?
Absolutely. And this is where the debate gets even more interesting because feminist perspectives challenge that neat conservative liberal dichotomy.
Okay.
Anti-pornography feminists argue that the real issue isn't just about obscenity. It's about how pornography can contribute to the exploitation and oppression of women.
So this isn't just prudishness. It's about the potential for real harm.
Exactly.
What are some of the specific harms that they're concerned about?
Well, a big one is the exploitation of women in the production of pornography. Think of Linda Marchiano, Linda Lovelace, the star of Deep Throat. She was subjected to horrific abuse and coercion, and her experience raises serious questions about whether anyone can truly consent to participate in an industry with such a dark side.
Wow, that's a pretty stark reminder that we can't just have this philosophical discussion in a vacuum. It has real-world implications.
Absolutely.
And it makes you wonder, even if the content itself isn't violent, is there an inherent level of exploitation in the production process, especially given the power dynamics at play?
It's a question worth considering, but beyond the production, there's also the question of whether consuming pornography can lead to harmful attitudes and behaviors. Some feminists argue that pornography can contribute to a culture that objectifies and dehumanizes women, making it tougher to combat things like sexual harassment and assault.
That's a serious charge. But it seems really tricky, maybe even impossible, to regulate something as subjective as material that objectifies women. And where do you even draw the line?
You're right, and this is where the debate gets especially thorny, especially from a legal standpoint. One attempt to create a more concrete framework was the McKinnon and Dworkin Anti-Pornography Ordinance. They defined pornography as a form of sex discrimination, specifically focusing on material that subordinates women through depictions of violence, humiliation, or pain.
So they were trying to move beyond just vague notions of obscenity
Yeah.
and ground the argument for regulation in the realm of civil rights. That's interesting. But I'm guessing that didn't go over well with everyone, especially those who are really committed to free speech.
Oh, you're absolutely right. This ordinance sparked a huge backlash, even from some feminists who, were sympathetic to the goal of protecting women, but worried that defining pornography as sex discrimination was too broad that it could lead to a dangerous, slippery slope.
A slippery slope.
Silencing important voices and artistic expression.
Well, it seems like we've hit on one of the core tensions in this debate.
Mm.
How do we balance the right to free expression with the need to protect individuals and groups from harm?
Exactly. And that tension is where things get really interesting.
So we've got this real clash, right, between folks who are all about unrestricted freedom of expression and those who argue that pornography, even without graphic violence, can still perpetuate harm, especially against women. How do liberals generally respond to those concerns?
Well, a lot of liberals, while they get the potential for harm, they're worried about going down a slippery slope with censorship. Like, if we start restricting speech based on its potential to, I don't know, subordinate a certain group, where does it stop? Won't that open the door to all kinds of limits on expression, even stuff that has real social or artistic value?
That's a valid point. I mean, as a philosopher, I'm always a bit cautious when it comes to any argument that seems to limit freedom of thought and expression.
Yeah.
But haven't some feminists argued that pornography doesn't just offend people, it actually silences women, making it harder for them to really be heard and understood?
Yeah, and that's where this idea of silencing is so important. Philosopher Ray Langton, she builds on McKinnon's work and argues that pornography can basically make certain speech acts unspeakable for women.
Unspeakable, huh? That's a strong word. Can you maybe break that down a little? I'm sure our listener, being a philosopher themselves, would appreciate a closer look at that concept.
Sure, think about it this way. Pornography can create this distorted environment for communication where the usual meanings of words, especially words about consent and refusal, they get all twisted or even become meaningless. So a woman saying no in a sexual situation might not be taken seriously, as a genuine refusal because pornography has kind of conditioned viewers to see a woman's no as like part of a performance or just a game.
So it's not just that pornography depicts harmful things, it's that it actually changes the way we interpret communication, especially when it comes to sex. That's kind of subtle, but really insidious, isn't it?
Exactly. It takes away a woman's agency, her ability to communicate her desires and boundaries in a way that's actually effective. And this challenge to traditional liberal thinking, that's what makes the feminist critique so powerful.
Also,
It forces us to really look at the limits of these abstract principles like free speech when those principles don't take into account the power dynamics and social context, where communication is actually happening.
it seems like anti-pornography feminists are really pushing us to go beyond this purely individualistic view of rights and think about the broader social and cultural forces that are in play.
Yeah, they want us to see that freedom of speech isn't just about what individuals can say or do on their own, but whether everyone has an equal chance to actually be heard and understood.
Which takes us back to the harm principle.
Right.
Liberals usually argue that the only reason to restrict liberty is to prevent harm to others. But how do we even define harm here? Is
Yeah.
it just physical harm, or can it include these more subtle forms of, silencing and subordination?
That's the real question, and it's something philosophers have been trying to figure out for ages.
Yeah.
If we define harm too narrowly, then we might not be protecting vulnerable groups from these real, even though they're less obvious, forms of harm. But if we define it too broadly, then we could end up justifying censorship that actually shuts down important expression and dissent.
Feels like we're in this philosophical catch-22.
In a way, yeah. And this is where I think your expertise as a philosopher really comes in. It's about examining these competing values, looking closely at the nuances of each argument, and thinking about the potential consequences of different approaches.
So we're not going to find a simple, clear-cut answer in some philosophical text, are we?
I don't think so. This is a messy, real-life issue, and there are no easy solutions.
And for a philosopher, that's probably the most exciting part.
Right.
It's a challenge. It makes us think harder, dig deeper, and grapple with all the complexities of these issues.
Absolutely. It demands that we move beyond these abstract principles and really consider the concrete ways in which power, inequality, and social context all shape how we understand freedom, harm, and even language itself.
Okay, so we've explored the harm principle, we've talked about silencing, and the idea that pornography can create this distorted environment for communication.
Mm.
But let's shift gears a little. Is there any kind of middle ground here? Are there ways to address the potential harms of pornography without going straight to legal restrictions?
That's a great point, and it leads us to think about non-legal solutions. One approach is to try to counter those harmful messages with positive ones, like public education campaigns that promote healthy sexuality, respect, and equality.
So it's kind of like fighting fire with fire, but in this case, it's more like fighting bad speech with good speech.
Yeah, exactly. But it's important to recognize that this approach has limitations.
Like what?
Well, it's tough to counter speech that's working on a mostly subconscious level or speech that has already silenced certain groups. Think about trying to have a rational debate with someone who's been heavily influenced by a lot of misogynistic pornography.
It's almost like arguing with a wall. You're trying to use logic and reason, but they're coming from a totally different set of assumptions and interpretations.
Right. And that's why some feminists argue that we need to go deeper, address the root of the problem, the underlying social and cultural forces that allow pornography to thrive and have this harmful influence.
So it's not enough to just try to change individual minds. We have to change the whole context where those minds are formed. That's a big challenge.
It is. But for a philosopher like you, someone who understands complex social systems and how power and culture interact, that's where the real intellectual work lies. It's about asking those big questions, the uncomfortable ones, that force us to confront our own biases and assumptions.
We're really talking about a fundamental shift in how we think, not just about pornography, but about how we approach freedom, equality, and the nature of communication itself. It's a lot to take in, but I think we've given our listener a solid starting point to continue grappling with these ideas.
I agree. We've explored the key arguments, the main points of tension, and hopefully opened up some new paths for philosophical inquiry. Now, it's up to you, dear listener, to take it from here and continue exploring the complex world of pornography, censorship, and the search for a truly just and equitable society.
It feels like we've only just dipped our toes into this whole debate.
And that's what makes it so fascinating. Every layer we uncover just reveals more and more intricate philosophical questions. For someone like you, listener, with a philosophical mind, this must be like a playground of ideas to explore.
All right. It really is. And it's interesting how this conversation has gone beyond just pornography and censorship, right?
Yeah.
We're getting into freedom of expression, harm, power dynamics, even the philosophy of language.
Exactly. Pornography kind of acts like this lens, a lens through which we can examine all these bigger social and philosophical questions. It really makes us confront those gray areas where our values clash and easy answers are nowhere to be found.
So as we wrap up here, what's the one key takeaway you'd like our listener to really ponder?
I think it's this realization that this debate isn't just about the content itself, the images, the videos, the stories. It's about all the stuff beneath the surface, the social structures, the power dynamics, the cultural norms that really shape how we understand gender, sexuality, and even freedom. It's about realizing that even those choices we make in private, like what we choose to watch or read, they can have these ripple effects throughout society.
So it's a call to be more aware, more critical, not just of the content itself, but the whole system that creates and distributes it.
Exactly. It's about asking those tough questions, like who benefits from this? Who's being harmed? Are there different ways to express sexuality that are more equitable and empowering? These are questions that every philosopher, and especially one who cares about social justice, should be asking.
It really is a reminder that philosophy isn't just some abstract intellectual exercise. It's a tool for understanding and changing the world.
Absolutely. And for you, listener, this deep dive has given you that tool. We've looked at the arguments, exposed the contradictions, and hopefully sparked your curiosity to explore more. Now it's your turn to take it further. Challenge those assumptions, question the norms, and use your philosophical insights to imagine a world where freedom and equality can really thrive.
Wow, what a fantastic way to end this. To our listener, thank you so much for joining us on this journey. We hope you've gained some new perspectives, some new insights, and maybe even some new questions to think about. And remember, the best philosophers are the ones who never stop questioning, never stop challenging, and never stop searching for a deeper understanding. Until next time, keep those philosophical wheels turning.